Hello everybody, this video is entitled HIMS Stock V Relentless Comeback because we are up 13% today. This is one of the biggest days for HIMS that I've seen in a while. And folks, I've said it before so many times on this channel, crazy volatility is part of the game for a stock like HIMS, and it is part of the game for most stocks that I cover on this channel. Crazy vol to the upside and the downside is the price that has to be paid for high returns. If an asset is not volatile, an asset is not going to return much money. Look at bonds. Bonds are not very volatile, but bonds don't double, or at least they don't double in a time horizon that we like, and they likely won't double. So people who were late into the stock like me, so I started covering this stock around $5 to $6. We're only sitting at 3 times our money. People who were early in this stock, I'm talking specifically about, for example, Investor in Innovation. You may remember him. He was one of the very first person on X that was very, very big on HIMS at around $3. One of the earliest bull, right? Is a UK pharmacist. You probably know him if you follow HIMS. He's sitting at 6x their money. HIMS, over the long run, has performed quite well, actually. And yes, of course, a lot of folks bought at 32 or even higher. And I suppose if you bought at 32, you'd be down 50%. But folks, that's the game. Some assets will never do a 5x, will never do a 10x. And if you want an asset to do a 2x in a year, that asset, by definition, also has to have the ability to have it. If it can double, it can have, right? Volatility goes both ways. Everybody wants just upward volatility and no downward volatility, but this is not how the stock market works. Heavily debated companies like HIMS see vol to the downside and to the upside. And so today is an epic day for HIMS. HIMS is still universally hated, but this will fade. This is not the first time in the history of HIMS that the stock is universally hated. Absolutely not the first time. The early days, ED was the main criticism of HIMS. Then it was marketing. Then it was a CEO tweet about who they would hire. Now it's GLP-1. There's always so much FUD on these stocks, but folks who are FUDsters, shorts, they don't look at the facts. The facts is that, you know, I would have been fearful had I seen the guidance be actually flat, right? But the guidance of HIMS, you know, unlike another stock that I covered in general, Oddity, where they went from 20% revenue growth guidance to minus 30% guidance, delta of 50%, that's very bad. HIMS's guidance, all of the bears were saying no more growth, we're going to be flat. This is not what they guided. They guided 24% revenue growth without the eucalyptus acquisition. If you add the eucalyptus acquisition, which will be in the early second half of 2026, you are closer to a 33% revenue growth guide for HIMS. This is from my prior video how I get to these numbers. You can see full year 2026, they guided between 15 and 24%. But that does not include, despite the FUD, that does not include the eucalyptus ARR. Eucalyptus ARR is 450 million, growing triple digit, by the way. So I'm not even including by how much this ARR could have grown in the second half of early 2026. But if you add the 9% to the guidance, what do you get? You get a low of 15 plus 9, so you get a low ball revenue growth is 24%. Bad case scenario, and a great case scenario would be 24% plus the 9% of eucalyptus, so that will be 33%. So the guide, if you include the eucalyptus acquisition, is between 24% and 33%, which means that if I put this guide in my spreadsheet halfway, I put it at 28.5, it's rounded up in the spreadsheet, so 29% rounded up, I get an enterprise value over gross profit over revenue growth of a 0.07. The rule of 40 is still there at 43, so you have a stock who still achieves the rule of 40, who is still dirt cheap and extremely attractive in my view, despite the biggest FUD storm that I've ever seen one of the stocks I own get, right? Strategy got a lot of FUD. I would argue HIMS has had even more FUD. And today, because it is a volatile stock, today the stock is rebounding and people are realizing that maybe trading at $14 maybe was a little extreme. Maybe it was a little too low. So why is the stock today? Well, I guess the market is realizing that all of a sudden, a stock like HIMS in the healthcare sector, direct-to-consumer subscription business, they're realizing that there's no geopolitical risk in HIMS. No, there's none. No geopolitical risk. We just operate in the US mostly, and we have a little bit of international. International will be meaningful next year, but not this year. And the market is also realizing that unlike SaaS companies, HIMS doesn't have an AI risk because HIMS is still a physical product. You're shipping a drug, a physical product is being used. So HIMS can't be erased, just like any of the many SaaS companies that I don't really cover on this channel, but you take any random SaaS company like Monday.com, for example, or if people are arguing Duolingo could be erased by a new app that's vibe coded. Well, you don't have that problem with HIMS. You can't vibe code a lab. You cannot vibe code that. You can't vibe code a network of about 2,000 prescribers, 2,000 MDs, 2,000 NPs. You can't vibe code that two-party network, two-sided networks that HIMS has created on the back end. And you can't vibe code the data, the 2.5 million customers that HIMS has, all of the interaction, all of the prescription data, all of the outcomes data, all of the questionnaires. You can't vibe code that. HIMS has the data. HIMS can use AI to build on that data. And then, of course, the market is realizing that maybe, just maybe, the legal risk may have been overstated. Today, we have HIMS House reporting on the legal stuff. As you know on this channel, I really don't think it's a big deal in my view, but they both parties agreed to extend a deadline for the lawsuit, and it's now until April 1 to respond to a Novo complaint. So they both agreed to extend the headline, and my guess is that they both have an incentive to drag this as long as possible, to extend this deadline as long as possible, because the courts are very much backed up. So in my view, this would be a trial, a jury trial in 2029. That's my view, but you see that deadline is already being dragged out because they're already agreeing to drag it out. And then, of course, if HIMS were to lose, they would do an appeals, which would lead it to like 2031. But then the question is, Novo probably has an incentive to drag this out as well, because the odds are the lawyers of HIMS, in my view, they're going to go after, can you patent a peptide? Can you patent a peptide? This is one of the very, very big debates in this field. Peptides are not regular drugs. They're naturally occurring drugs. The GLP-1 peptide is naturally occurring in the stomach. Yes, they modified it so that it lasts a long while in the stomach. But, you know, could you have just encapsulated it into a fat delivery system, like a liposomal delivery system? Could you have done that? You know, can you do a peptide in a pill that you need to take, 5 times a day? The pill, can you do that? I think there would be very interesting questions as to whether you can patent a peptide or not. And these are ancient debates. Where similar debates are like, can you patent a color? Or a word? Can you use a word as a trademark? Can you patent a color? Anyways, the point is that, do they really want to go to court about this? I believe they both have an incentive to have the status quo, especially when you have RFK, who's openly speaking today about potentially legalizing 14 peptides for compounding, including BPC 157. So if you know anything about peptides, of course, the number one peptide is the GLP-1 peptide. But the second peptide that's extremely popular is BPC 157. So if that becomes fair game for compounding, all of a sudden, who has a peptide compounding facility, right? HIMS. Who's going to be able to sell BPC 157? HIMS, and you've probably heard of BPC 157. That's in its own right. That's a revolutionary peptide that they could sell, and there's more. So, last point, and this is what the market I think could be realizing, and I've said that on the channel before. Many people maybe disagree with me, but if you look at the fact, Hims probably doesn't sell a lot of liraglutide, right? Liraglutide, Hims probably doesn't sell a lot, even though it's an off-patent, perfectly fine GLP-1 that there's no issue with patent. It's in the public domain. Most people already, as it is, wants tirzepatide. Tirzepatide, Hims doesn't sell tirzepatide, but semaglutide is already losing the race. Semaglutide is way less popular than tirzepatide. Tirzepatide is not sold by Hims, but the odds are, this is what I've said on the channel, maybe it's a hot take, but I don't think it's that big of a hot take. The odds are that once the FDA approves retatrutide, the demand for compounded semaglutide is just going to stop. That's my guess. My guess is that people who take these GLP-1s, they are in the know. I think the demand for compounded semaglutide is just gonna dwindle. It's gonna be gone once retatrutide becomes a thing. At least that's the consensus that I see in people who follow the Novo versus Lilly. So retatrutide is a game changer. It's gonna be a game changer, and therefore Hims, realizing that the GLP-1 business is likely going away in 6 to 9 months. I mean, not that it's reflected in the stock price, but it's likely going away. What are they trying to do? They're selling 6 months prescription. For $1,200, you can buy 6 months of it, and they're partnering with Klarna to pay for it. I would argue that's very, very, very smart. Do it up front, because you don't know when the FDA is going to approve retatrutide, but my intuition is that when they approve retatrutide, the demand for semaglutide is just going to be gone. So, well, I'm exaggerating, but it's not going to be very high. So better lock in 6 month sales right now, and that way you remove a lot of that overhang risk of potentially retatrutide being approved early. So anyways, I think these are all the reasons why the stock is shooting up, but quite simply, the bigger reason is that it was simply too cheap. It's just simply too cheap. The market has gone too far with this one. I'm so happy to own Hims. I'm so happy to still have my full position in Hims. Anyways, this was not investment advice. This is not financial advice. This is only entertainment. I'm hoping you were entertained. Please like, please subscribe, follow me on Patreon, follow me next. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.